Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. A controversial national security columnist at Bloomberg, Eli Lake, has advice for Donald Trump on the Iranian nuclear deal. Don't pull out of the nuclear agreement, Lake advises. Just tie the Iranians up in endless negotiations and wait. Wait for what? Wait for Iran to collapse. Since 1979, Iran has been run by religious scholars, religious fanatics, Iran's Ayatollahs. The word Ayatollah means a supreme Muslim scholar, a guy who knows Sharia law down to the very last detail, knows it upside down, backwards, and forwards. And the Ayatollahs have ruled Iran with an iron hand, with the help of the imams. But these scholars of Sharia law are in serious trouble, these interpreters of Sharia law. Says Lake, in late December, protests broke out throughout the country, and those Iranian protests haven't stopped. Instead, they've multiplied. Just look at the headlines from the last few months. Water crisis spurs protests in Iran. That's Reuters. Iranian steelworkers hold protests. That's the Voice of America. Security measures tightened in Iran's Ahwaz as protests continue. That's Saudi Arabia's newspaper, Asharq al-Wasat. And topping all the other headlines, quote, is a military coup possible in Iran? That's from Al Jazeera. Then there are the banks. Lake says there's been a run on Iran's banks. I've looked, I can't find evidence of that. But another Bloomberg report by another author says that Iran is about to face something it's never experienced before, a full-blown banking crisis, by which he means a full-blown banking collapse. The Iranian rial has gone down 30% in just 4 months. And banks do not have the cash to give loans. In fact, the bad debt on the books of Iran's banks could cause the nation's entire banking system to implode. But that's not all. Lake says that there's a drought. Crops are failing for lack of water. And says Lake, farmers are being driven off their land. And says Lake, the regime has started arresting environmental activists who are talking about this water problem. But that's not all. There was what Lake calls a leak of the official budget. It showed that billions of dollars were funneled to Iran's military and revolutionary guards. For what? To make war in Syria and Yemen. To make expensive wars, quote, while Iran's youth unemployment rate continues to skyrocket. That leak set off more protests. Protests in which, according to Lake, demonstrators chant slogans, because these demonstrations are ongoing, that proclaim that Iran should focus on the problems at home and not on sowing mischief abroad. On top of that, Lake reports that there is debate and protest over the detention of a cleric who has dared to challenge the divine authority of Iran's supreme leader, its supreme dictator, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And an even greater challenge, says Lake, comes from Iran's exiled Nobel laureate and human rights lawyer Shirin Ebadi, who, along with other activists, are now calling for indigenous regime change, that is, local Iranian regime change, through a UN-monitored referendum that would eliminate Khamenei's position of supreme leader altogether. That would knock the Ayatollahs off the top of the heap. In other words, the Iranian government, according to Lake, is in trouble. As a former Iran specialist for the RAND Corporation, Ali Reza Nadir told Lake, Iranians want change. And Lake believes there is a democratic opposition that can take over if the Ayatollahs are driven from power. That's why Lake advises Donald Trump to hold his horses and tie the Iranians up in endless negotiations. Just wait, says Lake, and Iran will collapse from within. This is an interesting position to consider, and Lake backs it up with a lot of information. But what's the reality? Yes, Lake's argument is worth paying attention to, but it's probably wrong. The current Iranian regime of the Ayatollahs and the Imams has been in power for 39 years. It's weathered enormous catastrophes. For example, an 8-year war with Iraq in which Iran's cities were bombarded with Iraqi missiles, thousands of them. Iran has tremendous stability. It is very unlikely to collapse while Donald Trump is in power, perhaps not even while you and I are alive. And if Iran does collapse, it could easily become a breeding ground for Muslim extremist groups. There are two positives. Iran is a Shiite country. I've lost my place here. Bear with me. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are Sunni, and they are determined to kill every Iranian and every Shiite on the face of the earth. So if the reign of the Ayatollahs falls, Al-Qaeda and ISIS don't stand a chance. They won't be able to find a foothold in Iran. And one more thing. There is a huge mass of Iranians who fled the country when the Ayatollahs seized power in 1979. They were hoping that they were making a secular revolution, and they were shocked when the religious crazies, the Ayatollahs, the Sharia scholars, took over what they thought was their revolution. So they fled. And they're in countries like America, they're all over Europe today. And this huge mass of Iranian exiles, they want regime change. They want a secular, democratic government to take charge so they can go back home. And they are modern, they are pluralistic, they are tolerant, they are magnificent, secular, intelligent people. They are some of the most intelligent among us. There is a remarkably good chance that if the Ayatollahs did fall, this vast mass of talented Iranians could indeed piece together a democratic regime. But don't hold your breath. This is Howard the Humongous, speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make. Or, want to know why? Ask how. And now for the sleazy, slimy, sneaky, I think I've got it, little off button.